let's get started. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Ken Norman from Princeton. Ken did his PhD at Harvard, then a postdoc at Colorado, University of Colorado in Boulder, and has been since 2002 at Princeton. And he's really been key in shaping the way people think about how we encode new memories, how the role of the hippocampus and the cortex and their interactions. Looking forward to your talk, Ken. You go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Aya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. And so today I'm going to be presenting work that was done by a big team of people, including my current grad students, Andre Buchers and Chi-Hong Liu, who goes by Q. My former postdoc, Janice Chen, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins. My former postdoc, Sylvie Collin, who is a professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. My current postdoc, Sebastian Mickelman, and my faculty colleague, who I know many of you know, Ori Hassan. Great. So to motivate our research, I want to start by playing a brief 20-second clip from a movie. I'll do that right now.
Shoes, belt, watch. You never been to an airport, dummy?
Okay, so everyone in the room understands what happened in the video, right? So when you go through airport security, we all know you're supposed to take all your metal items and put them in the bin. And this guy set off the metal detector because he's in a rush and he didn't take off all his metal items, right? And furthermore, we can all predict what happens next, right? Since the detector beeped, the security guard isn't going to let the guy in the blue shirt go on, right? The guard's going to make the guy in the blue shirt go back through the detector or search him or something, right? So this example, I think, nicely illustrates that all of us have an amazing ability to extract meaning from rich continuous stimuli, right? So we hear about advances in AI and computer vision all the time, but our human ability to extract meaning goes far beyond the state of the art in AI. Right. Computer vision system can tell you, like, this is a metal detector and this guy in the blue shirt is standing, but there's a huge gap from saying this is a metal detector to the understanding that all of us have about what just happened in the clip. Okay, so why are people so great at understanding these videos and also understanding real life? Right. A big part of the story is that we bring our prior knowledge to bear on understanding the situation. Right. So over the course of a lifetime, we build up a library of knowledge about how different situations work. So like what usually happens when you go to an airport, what usually happens when you listen to a talk. Right. So I'll refer to this general knowledge of how a situation works as an event schema. Right. And when we're out in the real world or watching a movie, we infer which one of our stored schemas is relevant, and we use that schema to organize what we're experiencing. So for example, you've all been to lots of lectures. So you know that lectures have speakers and topics. And as you process my lecture, you'll fill in these values, right? The speaker is me and the topic is event memory. So I'll refer to this knowledge of which schema is relevant and also what the fillers are as your event model, right? So this event model reflects your understanding of what's currently going on. Right? And importantly, in addition to storing general knowledge about events, we all have the ability to remember specific instances of these event types. Right. So I know how airport security works in general, but I can also remember waiting for an hour at this airport checkpoint in Newark when I showed up one day at rush hour. Right. And so episodic memory is useful because specific situations recur all the time. Right. I could end up at Newark Airport again at rush hour. And if I remember this specific annoying experience of waiting in line, I'd know to avoid this security checkpoint and maybe go to a different one. All right. To summarize what I've said thus far, our ability to understand events involves bringing multiple memory systems to bear on perception, right? This library of generalized knowledge or schemas, right? And also snapshots of specific events, right? And so one of the major goals of my lab's research is to achieve a mechanistic understanding of how these different memory systems work together to help us predict what will happen next, right? And I think there are deep unanswered questions here, and I'm going to focus on two key challenges today, right? So I've argued that we rely on a library of schemas to understand the world, right? And so the first challenge is, how do we acquire this library of schemas, right? We aren't born with knowledge about airports and lectures and grocery shopping, right? And importantly, as we add to this library, we need to hold on to existing knowledge, right? This is a famously hard problem, which Steve Grossberg also famously labeled the stability plasticity dilemma, right? It's hard because of neural networks' tendency to show catastrophic interference, right? To completely forget previously acquired knowledge when they learn new things, right? And as I'll discuss in a minute, we have several ideas about how the brain mitigates catastrophic interference, but it's still unclear how the brain solves this problem at scale. Okay, the second challenge is, how do we use episodic memory in the service of event understanding, right? So the vast majority of memory experiments throughout the recent history of psychology have looked at episodic memory in very artificial circumstances, right? So in a typical lab memory experiment, participants might view a list of novel word pairs like absence hollow or table blimp, right? And later on, participants might be given cues like the first word in the pair, and they're asked to retrieve the second word in the pair, right? And the standard sort of theory of how we remember these word pairs is that the hippocampus somehow takes a snapshot of the word pair at encoding and then retrieves or pattern completes that memory at test, right? But importantly, in lab experiments, we make it really clear when the participant's supposed to store and retrieve these snapshots, right? Everything's discretized. So when a word pair like absence hollow appears on screen, you know you're supposed to memorize that pair, right? And when a word appears with a question mark next to it, you know you're supposed to retrieve the associate, right? And you can contrast this with what happens in real life, right? In the real world, your senses are feeding you a continuous input stream. And most of the time, there's no one telling you when to take snapshots or what to store and when to retrieve this information. Okay, so because memory research is focused on these well-defined, relatively discretized learning situations, we have very little idea of how memory works in the wild, outside of these contrived situations when no one's quizzing us and we're just trying to understand what's going on, right? So when do we store memories? What information is stored? When is it retrieved? And how does the brain do all this, right? And to answer these questions, we need to run memory experiments using sort of richer, more naturalistic stimuli. And we also need memory models that speak to this issue, right? So there needs to be a shift from thinking about memory as a kind of thing unto itself, like a butterfly pinned to a page, to thinking about episodic memory as a resource we can use, right? So we need computational models to help us understand when and how we can use this resource, right? And that'll be a big part of what I talk about today. All right, so here's an outline of the rest of the talk. The first module will address the question of how we build this library of schemas that I was describing earlier. And the second module will focus on how the brain uses episodic memory to support event understanding. Okay, so how do we build a library of schemas? All right, so I'm going to start with a very quick review of ideas about how the brain solves this stability plasticity dilemma I mentioned a few minutes ago. All right, so the basic complementary learning systems theory that was laid out in this famous paper by McClellan, McNaughton, and O'Reilly is that cortex uses a feature-based neural code where stimuli that have similar features, like these birds, activate similar neural representations, right? And so this feature-based neural code is useful because it supports generalization, right? Stimuli with similar features activate, right? Like I said, overlapping neural codes, right? And that gives you sort of generalization for free, right? The drawback of this kind of overlapping code is this potential for catastrophic interference, right? Because the sort of physical substrate of all these memories overlap, strengthening one of these bird memories could end up weakening these other overlapping bird memories, right? And so one way to limit this overwriting problem is to have cortex learn slowly, right? And in their famous 1995 paper, McClellan et al. Argued that cortex can get away with learning slowly because hippocampus can rapidly memorize individual patterns and play them back to cortex, right? So if hippocampus is doing the fast learning using these non-overlapping codes, that lets cortex sort of get away with slower learning with these overlapping codes, right? But importantly, this paper also established that slow learning alone is not sufficient to protect cortex from catastrophic interference. Learning also has to be interleaved, right? So if you want the network to come to know about the distinctive features of all these different birds, you need to keep sort of looping through the full set, right? And if, for example, you don't include hummingbirds in the training playlist that you're feeding to cortex, then cortex will forget about the unique features of hummingbirds. That's how catastrophic interference works. Okay. Offline learning can help with interleaving, right? So part of this complementary learning system story is that if stimuli aren't presented in an interleave fashion during wake, maybe the brain can interleave them during sleep, right? But I want to highlight interleave learning can only take you so far, right? As the set of things you need to remember gets big enough, right, interleaving the whole set becomes infeasible, right? So let's just say we want to store knowledge about these airplanes in cortex, right, along with the birds. The airplanes have some features like wings and sky, right, these pictures in common with birds, right? We can try fitting them into cortex, right? But now, since they're going to overlap, we need to interleave the airplanes together with the birds, right? And in the setup, if you keep studying airplanes but no birds, right, the new airplane memories are going to overwrite the bird memories, right? And as you keep adding more memories, the list of things you need to interleave gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so a potential solution to this problem is to split cortex up into separate networks, right? So for example, you could have one that's specialized for airplanes, and then this different set of cortical neurons that's specialized for birds, right? This has costs in terms of generalization, right? So if you split the network, it gets harder to generalize from airplanes to birds, right? There's also a need for extra control infrastructure to determine which network you use at a particular moment. Do you use the airplane network or the bird network, right? But the splitting has a huge benefit, right? Which is massively reduced interference, right? You can now learn about airplanes without overwriting your bird memories, right? The idea here is that if you split in a way that properly carves the world at its joints, right? So if most of the generalization that you end up wanting to do is within network, then the cost to generalization of splitting should not be too bad, right? And the claim here is that on balance, maybe this benefit of splitting outweighs the costs, right? A lot of cognitive models have been developed that fit with this splitting idea. So there's event segmentation theory, latent cause theory, the sustained categorization model that Brad Love and colleagues have developed, right? And according to these models, when you're put in a new situation, you infer which one of your stored schemas is relevant, right? You use that schema to make predictions. And when the current schema is no longer doing a good job of generating accurate predictions, then you just load up a different schema from the library, or maybe you form an entirely new one. Okay, the most recent instantiation of these ideas is the structured event memory model, or SEM, which Nick Franklin and Sam Gershman and other colleagues of ours described in a psych review paper that came out last year, right? So in SEM, we use recurrent neural networks to model how we process events. So according to SEM, we have a library of RNNs where each RNN models a class of events, like for example, what happens during restaurant meals. Right, so you can think of each RNN as a kind of prediction machine that's trained to predict the next sensory input, right? And when one of these RNNs in SEM makes a large prediction error, then there's this inference network that's sitting off to the side that seeks out another RNN from your kind of library of RNNs that does a better job of explaining what just happened. And if none of those existing models do a good job, then it splits off a new network. Okay, so there's extensive behavioral evidence for models that split based on prediction error, right? But most of this evidence comes from very simple category learning or stimulus response association paradigms, right? Very few of these studies have looked at how we learn predictive models for how events unfold over time, like going to an airport, right? So the focus of a lot of our lab's recent work has been studying this process of schema learning, right, with the goal of testing model predictions about when schema learning will succeed or fail, right? And toward that end, we've started to run experiments where participants read computer-generated text stories or watch computer-generated animated movies about different kinds of events, right? And each different kind of event has its own generative model or schema that specifies sort of the sequence of observations, right, that occurs during that event, right? And then we can measure how well people learn the structure of these events. And a key feature of this work is we've set things up so the same experiments can be run on both humans and computational models, right? So here's how we generate stories, right? Every schema has a graph, like this one over here, that specifies a set of transitions between states, right? And every schema also has some slots that need to be filled in, right? So this schema happens to be for a narrative about a fight at a cafe, and has slots for the sort of protagonist of the story and the victim and the location and the drink that people order and so on, right? And so to generate a particular instance of a story, we first assign fillers to the slots. So we can say in this version of the fight at a cafe story, Alice is the protagonist and Bill is the victim, right? And to generate a story, we traverse this graph starting at the start node according to these transition probabilities over here, right? And importantly, every one of these states, the little circles that's visited, generates some observable stimulus that makes up part of the narrative. Like when you visit the walk-in state, it generates this sentence. One morning, the subject, who's Alice here, walked into whatever the location is. When you visit the clumsy state, it generates this sentence and so on, right? And so by traversing this graph, you generate a full story, right? And the stories have the same skeleton, but they differ from sort of instance to instance because these transitions are probabilistic and because different fillers are assigned to these roles each time that you generate the story. Okay, so in an experiment, we expose participants, so either humans or models, to large numbers of narratives that are generated from a particular schema or schemas, right? And then to test people's learning, we use a stop and ask procedure that was pioneered by Jeff Zox's lab, right? And so the idea is that participants might be reading the story, like a sentence at a time. One morning, Alice walked into the coffee shop. Clumsily, Alice spilled a mocha all over whatever that says. And then the story pauses and you get asked, what happens next? Oh yeah, spills a mocha all over Bill, right? Does Bill overreact or does Bill not care, right? People have to guess, we record their response, and then the story continues and they find out that Bill, in fact, overreacts, all right? Okay, so our goal in running these experiments has been to test model predictions about learning, right? What's the best way to learn new schemas? And in particular, we've been looking at this sort of curriculum learning question, right? Is learning about new schemas better when the schemas are presented in a blocked fashion, right? You have a lot of stories from the same schema in a row, or an interleave fashion where you sort of go back and forth between the schemas that are generating the story, right? So this blocked versus interleave question is pretty rich and has a lot of dimensions. It's been studied extensively with regard to category learning, but really not at all in the realm of predictive schema learning, which is what we're trying to do here. Okay, so what do we predict, right? So models that don't split. So if you just take like an off-the-shelf recurrent neural network, right? What people have shown is that they generally predict that interleave learning, right? In the spirit of that McClellan paper I was describing, is going to be better than blocked due to catastrophic interference in the block condition, right? So if you keep learning about one schema without going back to the other, you're just going to overwrite your memory for the first schema, right? On the other hand, models that do have the splitting property I described can potentially avoid catastrophic interference in the block condition, right? So say that you train a block of stories from schema A before switching to schema B, right? While you're training on schema A, you're going to develop strong expectations about what will happen according to schema A, right? And this is going to lead to a big prediction error when the block ends and you switch to schema B, right? This prediction error, according to these theories, is going to cause a split, right? And then new knowledge about schema B is going to accumulate in a different sort of split network than schema A, right? And that protects schema A from interference, right? So as a result, models that split predict relatively better performance in the block condition compared to models that don't split. Okay, so to test this, my grad student, Andre Buchers, ran experiments where half the stories took place in one restaurant, which he called the Jungle Brew House, shown here in green, and the other half took place in another restaurant, which is called the Deep Ocean Cafe, right? And importantly, the same events happened in both places, but the transition paths were different, right? So stories set in the Jungle Brew House followed followed these sort of green transition paths, and stories that were set in the Deep Ocean Cafe followed these blue transition paths. So for example, in the brew house, the people who waited patiently in line ordered cake, right? Whereas the people who cut to the front of the line ordered tea. But in the Deep Ocean Cafe, it was exactly the opposite. The people who waited patiently ordered tea, and the people who cut in line ordered cake. Okay, we gave people lots of exposure to these stories, and we wanted to see how well they learned these different contingencies, right? And the key manipulation that I was alluding to a minute ago is that some people saw these stories in blocks. So like lots of cafe stories followed by lots of brew house stories, whereas other people saw them mixed together. All right, so Andre ran several conditions, and the condition he called blocked 40, basically people switch schemas after every 40 stories. So you see 40 cafe stories before getting 40 brew house stories. Right, so here are the prediction accuracy results from this block 40 condition. You can see that participants did quite well, right? So here's the block of schema A, schema B, schema A, schema B, right? And this final test period shown in red involved random alternation between the schemas, and participants performed extremely well here, showing they learned and retained both schemas. Okay, in the interleaved condition, participants switched schemas after every story. Right, and to our surprise, participants' performance in the interleaved condition was pretty terrible, right? So random chance here would be 0.5, and so people were on average above chance, but kind of just barely so. Okay, like I said, we weren't expecting performance to be so bad in the interleaved condition, right? One kind of simple explanation is maybe people just weren't noticing the location cube, right, which determined what graph they were, having their story generated from, right? The second probability is maybe people were actually fully aware of the locations, but they were still failing somehow to learn the underlying graphs, right? And so to address these possibilities, Andre ran another condition he called interleaved explicit, right? So just like the interleaved condition before, right, but we disclosed the location, so cafe or brew house, in every sentence. The location was bold-faced, and we told people to attend to location, right? And people did a little better here than they did before in the interleaved condition, but they were still like way worse than in the block condition, right? And this shows that people's failure to learn the interleaved condition is not simply a matter of failing to notice the location. It looks like even when they're noticing it perfectly well, they're still having problems. All right, so how do we interpret these results? Right. So actually, we set up this experiment before we actually run any computational models on the task. So the first thing we did after getting this kind of surprising result was to just confirm that simple neural network models without splitting do well in the interleaved condition and do badly in the block condition. Right. So to test this, Andre ran this task on a standard off-the-shelf recurrent neural network. Right, and in this simulation, Andre first did a long period of interleaved training on the two schemas, then he switched to a period of training only on schema A. Right, and so Andre found that this simple recurrent neural network learned the task really easily when given interleaved training. Right, so when you signal at test that schema A is relevant, right, then the network gives the correct schema A answer, shown here in green. And when you signal at test that schema B is relevant, the network gives the correct schema B answer, shown here in blue, right? So the network's getting it right, and importantly, keeps getting it right when you switch to training only on schema A, right? It doesn't forget what it learned about schema B. Okay, next thing we verified is that in the block condition, the RNN does really badly, right? It shows catastrophic interference, right? So when you train on schema A in blocks, this is the sort of green periods over here, the network starts giving the A answer regardless of whether you're asking it about schema A or schema B, right? And when you start training on schema B in blocks, these blue periods over here, the network gives the B answer regardless of whether you're asking about schema A or schema B, right? So every new block overwrites what was learned in the previous one. Classic catastrophic interference. Okay, so these simple simulations confirm that on this task, right, as we expected, based on prior work, a standard kind of vanilla RNN with no splitting succeeds on interleaved and fails on blocked due to catastrophic interference. I just want to highlight, people show the exact opposite pattern here, right? So human performance on this task is incompatible with this sort of unified unsplit model, right? So in our current work, we're exploring whether models that are capable of splitting, like the structured event memory model I mentioned earlier, can explain the results. This is work in progress, but the sort of summary progress report is that models that split can easily explain good performance in the block condition for the exact reasons I discussed earlier, right? At the block boundary, there's a big prediction error, causes the thing to split, and then the splitting prevents catastrophic interference. Okay, as I mentioned before, the bigger puzzle is, why is interleaved performance so bad? So to put a point on it, why are people learning much less well than a very, very basic recurrent neural network, right? It does not put people in a very favorable light. And there are a bunch of ideas that we're exploring now through modeling, right? So one possibility is that people have a kind of sticky prior on schema inference, right? That is, maybe our brains are wired to assume that the underlying structure of the world changes slowly, right? And if this is true, this prior is going to create confusion in situations where the structure of the world happens to change quickly, right? And that's definitely true for our interleaved condition, where the rules of transitions are changing after each story, right? And so this idea about sticky priors has also been articulated quite nicely in some recent work by Timo Flesch and Chris Summerfield at Oxford. Another possibility that's not mutually exclusive with the first is that participants in the interleaved condition still split, but they just do it badly, right? So even though the interleaved condition is not engineered to create big prediction errors, there's no like block boundary where you're shocked at what happens, right? People still experience frequent small prediction errors, right? And if these smaller prediction errors cause splitting, it's going to result in the participant sort of inferring schemas that don't line up well with the actual structure of the task, right? And that's going to slow down learning. Okay. Okay, but regardless of the sort of which of those things or maybe other things are the exact right explanation, the sort of general prediction that arises from these splitting models is that doing block training before interleaved training should yield better learning than doing interleaved before blocked, right? The idea is that if you do block learning first, your brain will sort of learn how to carve up the world properly. But if you do interleaved learning first, you learn a kind of sort of more muddled model of the schemas, which is going to slow down learning from that point forward. Right. And so to test this, Andre compared 3 conditions. So in the blocked early condition, Andre presented a block of stories from schema A, then a block from schema B, and then 80 stories that were interleaved. Right. So here the blocks came at the very beginning of training. In the block middle condition, the blocks came in the middle of training, and the block late condition, the blocks came at the end of training. Right. But all of these conditions share the fact that they're 2 inserted blocks. They just vary in where the blocks are put, right? Early, middle, or late. Okay, here are the results. So as before, the final test period shown in red involved random alternation between schemas and all the conditions. So this red period is a sort of fair comparison between all the conditions. The plots on the left show the results from the first time we ran the study. The plots on the right show the results from a replication. And so basically the experiment came out exactly as we had predicted, right? If you get the blocks early, you asymptotically learn very well, right? But if these same blocks come later on after you've had a potential to sort of get confused, to like sort of learn the wrong structure with these interleaved trials, then you asymptote to a lower value. Okay, so to sum up this module, people show a blocked above interleaved advantage in our task, right? And models that split like SEM provide, we think, is a novel explanation for these results, right? So in the block condition, we think that people do well because they split well, right? They split in a way that matches the underlying structure of the world. And in the interleaved condition, we think people do poorly because they split poorly, right? They split in a way that does not line up with the actual structure of the task. Right. And so this whole pattern of results can be explained in terms of a stability plasticity trade-off, where you think that poor splitting, right, can impede plasticity in the interleaved conditioning, right? But maybe this is the price we pay for improved stability, right? For avoiding catastrophic interference in the block condition, right? When we infer the right kind of structure, right, then we get everything we want, but there's a risk that we can split things off in a way that doesn't match reality, and then that messes us up, right? And I want to just include an important caveat, right? I'm not arguing that blocked training will always be better. Like I said, blocked interleave is a pretty complicated issue, right? But if I wanted to sort of crystallize, why I think blocked is helping here, right? We think it's especially useful, and interleaving is especially harmful, right, in tasks where subjects have to discover latent structure, right? And we're arguing that the big prediction error at the block boundary helps participants to learn the right kind of latent structure. Okay. Just quickly, our next step for these schema learning studies is to study the neural representations of the schemas that people learn after block training, right? So we'd expect that regions that represent schemas, like maybe medial prefrontal cortex, should show distinct neural patterns for the two kinds of stories. And we expect these neural schema representations are going to guide the predictions that people make about upcoming events. So my postdoc, Sylvie Cullen, recently completed data collection for an fMRI experiment to test these ideas. We have some preliminary results that I actually cut out from the talk due to time. But yeah, so I'd say data analysis is underway, and at the end, people can ask me about this if they want. Okay, switching gears. For the next module of the talk, I'm going to focus on how the hippocampus supports event understanding. All right, so my lab's prior memory modeling work really focused in depth on how the hippocampus contributes to memory tasks, right? So for example, the site review paper that I did as a postdoc with Randy O'Reilly, right? But importantly, hippocampus doesn't just perk up when someone asks you a memory question, right? We think it contributes more ubiquitously, right? And so our current modeling work treats hippocampal episodic memory as a resource that the brain can draw upon just in trying to go about life, right? And understand events in the world, even if there's no overt memory demand, right? And we want to understand how the brain puts this resource to good use, right? And so the specific goal of our recent work is to build a neural network model that can make predictions about when encoding and retrieval will take place during event perception. All right, so I'm going to focus first on retrieval and then talk about encoding. I want to highlight this modeling work is all carried out by my student Q, right? And it's described in this preprint over here that we actually just updated a few months ago on bioRxiv. All right, so here's a diagram of the model. It has a cortex and a hippocampus. The model is given a sequence of stimuli, and cortex's job is just to predict, given the current state, what's going to happen next. Okay, the model is trained with reinforcement learning, right? So if the model predicts the next state correctly, it gets a reward. If it predicts incorrectly, it gets punished, right? And so training the model involves adjusting connections using gradient descent, right, to maximize the cumulative reward obtained by the network. Okay, so the cortical part of the model is just a standard recurrent neural network, right? So given the current state, it learns to predict the next state, right? And like all recurrent nets, it has the ability to actively maintain information over time in its hidden layer, right? So you can think of this hidden state over here as the model's working memory, right? You can also think of the learned weights in the cortical network, which encode regularities in the training environment, as the model's semantic memory, right? And importantly, our model is a memory augmented neural network, meaning that it also has this episodic memory buffer hooked up to the side that can store and retrieve hidden state patterns from cortex, right? So we think this part of the model roughly corresponds to the hippocampus, right? And so you can think of episodic memory in the model as a kind of dictionary, right? So every time the model stores a new episodic memory, it adds a row to the dictionary corresponding to that memory. Okay, and retrieval in the model is content-based, right? So when the model wants to retrieve, it matches the current hidden state in cortex to this sort of set of stored hidden states, right? And the simplest rule for retrieval would be to find the single best matching memory and send it back to cortex. But we've complicated this a bit by adding an adjustable retrieval gate that controls how much activation can spread into the hippocampus, right? So when the gate's closed, it blocks retrieval from taking place. All right. The most important property of the model, right, is that we don't set this retrieval gate by hand, right? Rather, the model learns to control the retrieval gate on its own. So in the model, there's a memory control layer that gets its input from the cortical network, right? And this memory control layer determines the setting of the retrieval gate, like how open or closed it is at each time point, right? So let's just stop for a second to reflect on what the setup means, right? Basically, it means it's up to the model to decide what to do with episodic memory, right? The model could keep the gate closed all the time and ignore episodic memory. It could keep the gate open all the time, or it could learn a gating policy that's somewhere in between, right? So as I said before, the model's overall goal is to maximize reward by making correct predictions, right? So when we train the model, it figures out a policy for setting the hippocampal gate that maximizes the reward it gets. Okay, so that's the model setup, right? We then have to choose which things to simulate with the model, right? And so we based our initial simulations on this very cool study that Janice Chen published in 2016 that we call the Twilight Zone study, because it involved people watching a Twilight Zone episode, this famous science fiction show, right? And there are 3 conditions in the study. In the recent memory condition, the participants watched the first half of the TV episode, and then immediately thereafter, they were scanned when they watched the second half, right? In the distant memory condition, participants watched the first half outside the scanner, and then they went away for 24 hours, right? And then they were scanned watching the second half of the episode, all right? And in the no memory condition, participants didn't get to watch the first half of the episode at all, and they were scanned then watching the second half. Okay, so in this recent memory condition, participants can rely on working memory to interpret what's going on, right? So let's just say that it's revealed at this point in the episode that while the servants in this household look like people, they're actually robots, right? Once you learn this, you can hold on to it in working memory. And then later on, when the main character asks her father, sort of horrifyingly, to kill all the servants, you'll understand that she's talking about robots, not people, right? In the distant memory condition, where there's this 24-hour gap, you can't just keep this fact continuously in working memory, right? Because you were thinking about other stuff during the one-day gap, right? So to properly understand this moment here in the second half, right, you need to retrieve the fact that servants are robots from the first half of the movie using episodic memory, right? So put another way, in the recent memory condition, there's a low demand for episodic recall because this information from the first half, it's already maintained in working memory, right? But in the distant memory condition, there's a high demand for episodic memory, right? You really need to episodically retrieve information from the first half of the movie to properly understand what's going on in the second half. Okay, so in her study, Janice looked at neural activity at the start of this second segment in the scanner, right? And she predicted that if hippocampus is sensitive to recall demand, right? So the hippocampus is sort of selectively engaged when there are gaps in your understanding of what's going on, right? It's going to interact more with cortex in the distant memory condition than the recent memory condition. And that's exactly what she found, right? So this plot shows the cortical regions that significantly interacted with the hippocampus in each of the 3 conditions, right? You can see there's a lot more cortex interacting with the hippocampus in the distant memory condition, right? So it really looks like the hippocampus gets consulted more when there's a need to fill in gaps in your understanding, right? And so this is a finding. We want to see if the model could explain this finding and other related findings. Okay, the scenario we simulated with the model is loosely based on the Twilight Zone study. So in each time step, the model observes some feature of the world. It needs to predict the next state, right? And importantly, the model learns to hold on to observed features in working memory, right? Because they're useful in predicting upcoming states, right? So for example, we might tell the model that it's raining outside at time point 3, and then it has to predict at time point 7 whether a character will put on a raincoat, right? In situations like that, sort of incentivize the model to take whatever it observes and keep it around, right? Actively in working memory in case it turns out to be useful. Okay, there are 2 simulated conditions. In the recent memory condition, the model views a continuous sequence of stimuli, and the distant memory condition, the sequence is presented in 2 chunks, and working memory is cleared in the middle, and that's meant to simulate the effects of the 24-hour gap, right? So here, in the DM condition, the model has to rely on episodic recall to bridge between the 2 halves of the sequence. Okay, this heat map here illustrates the point I just made about information accumulating in the model's working memory, right? So time is on this axis, right? And at each time point, the model observes a different feature, right? There's some sensory observation. That's what these little green boxes show. So like time point 0, it observes this feature. Time point 1, it observes this feature. The next time point, it observes this feature, and so on, right? And so the white colors in the heat map indicate that the observed value of that feature is decodable, right, from the model's working memory, right? So we basically did like multivariate pattern analysis on the neural network to figure out what information was sort of in its head, right? And what we see is that when the model observes a feature, it becomes decodable, which makes sense, right? And then the feature stays decodable over time, right? Showing that the model has kind of decided to hold these features in working memory, right? And as a result, the model's representation of what's going on in the situation, it builds over time, right? So if every time it observes a feature, it holds on to that feature, then more and more information is represented in the model's working memory as this event progresses, okay? We set things up so that the model encodes a single snapshot in episodic memory at the end of the event, right? And you can see that because information is sort of maintained in working memory, if you take a snapshot at the end, this is going to capture, right, a lot of the features that were observed earlier and are now being held onto in working memory, right? And I should add as a foreshadowing that I'll discuss alternative encoding policies later in the talk, right? But this is the encoding policy we started out with. Okay, since this example is a distant memory trial, the model's working memory gets flushed in between part 1 and part 2, right? And then at the beginning of part 2, the model doesn't know much about the ongoing situation, but it observes this feature, right? And based on that one feature, it can sort of pattern complete the episodic memory that it stored at the end of part 1. So all the information that was stored in working memory at the end of part 1 becomes active again, right? And this allows the model to predict some features of the situation before they're actually observed during part 2. All right, so that was meant to sort of orient you to sort of basically what the model is doing. Now I'll show some results from the model. And just as a reminder, Janice found more hippocampal-cortical interaction in the distant memory condition than in the recent memory condition, right? And I want to show you here, the model shows the exact same property, right? So the plots over here in this row show the strength of memory retrieval over time during the second part of the sequence, right? There's more recall in the distant memory condition than in the recent memory condition, right? And crucially, this isn't something that we built into the model, right? It's something that the model learned to do on its own. So we can ask, why does the model show this property, right? And so basically, when information is already loaded up in working memory, right, when there's no gap in the model's understanding, there's no benefit to recalling, and there's potentially a cost to recalling, right? So if you recall the wrong episodic memory, it can overwrite the correct information in working memory, right? And so basically, the model has figured out through reinforcement learning that it just doesn't pay to recall when it thinks it already understands what's going on. So it basically learns to keep the gate shut in the recent memory condition. Okay, we also looked at what happens when we change the size of the penalty on making a misprediction, right? And so we found that when the penalty on false recall and incorrect predictions is higher, right, the model waits longer to recall during the second part of the movie, right? And again, this is something the model learned to do on its own. So we can ask, why does the model do this, right? And the answer is that there's a speed accuracy trade-off, right? You want to fill in the gaps in your event model as quickly as possible by retrieving from episodic memory. But importantly, you also want to fill in the gaps accurately, right? You don't want to retrieve the wrong thing, right? And waiting longer allows you to observe more features of the current situation, right? And the more features you've observed, right, the better you're able to specify which memories are relevant and which memories aren't, right? So if you wait longer, you have a better chance of retrieving the right memory, but there's also this sort of opportunity cost, right, of not having used episodic memory before, and the model sort of finds a balance between these different factors. Okay, Q also showed a lot of other things in this preprint. So he showed that the model learns to be more cautious in retrieving information in environments where events are very similar and thus confusable, right? Makes sense because there's more potential for retrieving the wrong thing there. The model avoids retrieving from episodic memory if it can make clear predictions based on semantic memory, that is based on its knowledge of environmental regularities. He also showed that if you give the model access to a signal about whether an event is familiar or not, it learns to recall more strongly, right, in the presence of that familiarity signal, right? The idea is that if familiarity reliably indicates that there is a relevant memory, right, then the model can treat that as a green light to go ahead and like open the gate and let that memory in. All right, and again, the details of all these results are in the preprint, but I removed them from the talk due to time. All right, so to summarize the retrieval modeling, right, the model generates time point by time point predictions about when retrieval should occur to best support event understanding, right? And a key feature of the model is Hippocampus is adaptive, right? The optimal retrieval policy depends on the environment, like how similar the events are, the reward structure, like how bad is it to make a mistake, and so on, right? There's no single retrieval policy that works best all the time. And what we're excited about with this kind of model, right, comes from the fact that we can give it sort of any set of task demands, and it'll tell us what the best hippocampal retrieval policy is given those task demands, which can then serve as a prediction that we can go out and test. Okay, last sort of major part of the talk is to look at sort of encoding policy, right? So thus far I focused on sort of when is the right time to retrieve, right? But we're also interested in when is the best time to store these snapshots in the hippocampus, right? And so some relevant data comes from studies that have measured hippocampal activity during perception of events and related this to later memory for the events. Here we have been extremely strongly influenced by Aya Ben-Yaakov's work. And as you all well know, Aya has shown that the end of a video clip triggers increased response in the hippocampus, and the magnitude of the hippocampal response predicts later memory for the clip. Right, so one possible interpretation of this result is that when an event ends, the hippocampus stores a snapshot of that event so you can remember it later, right? And so these initial studies that looked at this issue used unrelated clips with obvious endpoints, right? But more recently, Aya and others have shown that you also get this hippocampal bump at event boundaries when people watch continuous narrative movies, right? And this study by Chris Baldessano showed that the size of the bump at the end of an event in one of these continuous movies predicts subsequent memory for the just completed event, right? And so this fits with the idea that encoding of event into episodic memory preferentially occurs at the end of the event, right? So in the simulations I showed earlier, the model was allowed to take a single episodic snapshot at the end of each sequence, right? And this instantiates the idea that encoding preferentially occurs at event boundaries, which we derived largely from Aya's work. Right? But we've also looked at like alternative encoding policies. So like what happens, for example, when we let the model take an additional snapshot midway through the event sequence, right? In addition to the snapshot that it takes at the end of the sequence, right? Intuitively, you think more snapshots would lead to better memory, right? But when we ran the model, we found that prediction accuracy is actually better if you force the model to wait until the end of the event sequence to take the snapshot, that's the blue bar, versus when you take this additional snapshot midway through. Okay, why is this the case, right? The intuition is that when events are starting out, right, it might not be clear what's happening, right? The longer you wait, like information accumulates in your mind, right? So if you wait to take a snapshot, it's going to contain more information about what's going on than if you take the snapshot earlier, right? And building more information into the snapshot makes that memory less confusable with other memories, which reduces false recall, right? So to illustrate this point with the cartoon that Q made, right? Let's say you observe an event where you go to your friend's house and it's sunny and you see that your friend is happy, and then you take a memory snapshot at the end of an event, right? All this information, house, sun, and friend, is in working memory at the end of the event, so it gets stored in the snapshot. And now you start observing a second event where you see your friend is sad, right? You go into their house and then it rains. All right, and from the very beginning of the second event, it's clear that this new event mismatches the stored snapshot, right? Your friend is sad here, but happy in the snapshot, so no recall takes place, right? Which is good, because it's a different set of circumstances, right? We can contrast this with a situation where you also take this snapshot midway through, right? After observing that it's sunny. Okay, oops, there we go, sorry, computer pause. Right, if you take this snapshot midway through, right, you're going to end up with this fragmentary memory as well as this more complete memory, right? Now you start observing the second event, right? You get to your friend's house. Now you've got this memory fragment linking the house with sunshine. There's nothing about your friend's mood in this snapshot. So there's no mismatch between this snapshot and the current event. So you end up recalling, like pattern completing this memory and predicting that it's going to be sunny, which ends up being wrong. Okay. Importantly, in addition to increasing the likelihood of false recall, these small chunks are harmful in another way, right? So they can actually directly interfere with retrieval of the end of event memories, right? So this house here matches both of these memories, the partial one and the complete one, equally well, right? So in the model, they compete to be retrieved, right? And importantly, this model from midway, the memory from midway through the event has less information in it, right? So if you end up retrieving this partial memory instead of the complete memory, you're going to end up retrieving less information, right? And thus being less able to make predictions. All right, so in summary, the model does better when we force it to wait until the end of an event to take a snapshot, right? For two reasons, right? Waiting to encode leads to more information-rich snapshots that are less confusable with other memories. And also, these sort of fragmentary memories can end up competing with and blocking retrieval of the more information-rich end-of-event memories, right? So we think this provides a kind of rational justification for Aya's results showing preferential encoding-related hippocampal activity at the end of events, right? We think it also has implications for AI systems, right? Which is that when it comes to episodic memory encoding, more is not always better, right? Like patience is a virtue. And so it's a case in AI that most memory augmented neural networks sort of encode all the time, right? These results suggest that in certain scenarios, you might do better with more selective encoding. Okay, so to summarize what I've said thus far, in the first part of the talk, I argued that Cortex adopts a splitting strategy for preventing catastrophic interference, whereby knowledge is organized into situation-specific modules or schemas, right? And our work importantly suggests that splitting is a double-edged sword, right? Results from our block condition show that splitting can be really useful if you split appropriately, right? If you carve nature at its joints, but results from our interleave condition suggest that splitting can be harmful if you don't split properly. All right. With regard to the hippocampus, I argue that hippocampus can store and retrieve sets of event features to support event understanding. Right? That should be relatively uncontroversial, right? But what we found with the model is that the hippocampus, in trying to maximize overall goodness of prediction, learns to retrieve on demand, meaning it's more prone to be consulted when there are gaps to fill, right? And the model performs best when storage occurs at the end of events because that yields maximally informative memory traces, right? And lastly, more broadly, I've argued, in keeping with a lot of colleagues in the field, right, that hippocampus, right, it's not just a memory structure, right, that gets consulted on memory task, it's a resource, right? And our simulations show how the brain can adapt how the hippocampus is used based on the demands of the environment. All right, I see I've basically run out the time. I have a few slides that I'm just gonna skip through in like 10 seconds, right? And they're just describing a few things that we're working on right now, but I just wanna convey the gist of it, and then I will close, right? So a distinctive feature of the model I described is that it makes time series predictions about when hippocampus will be engaged at encoding and retrieval, right? So the model predicts that encoding and retrieval will take place more strongly at some moments than others, right? And so one of the things we care about is trying to develop methods that are really well suited for testing these predictions, right? We know already that fMRI works to some extent, but we're also very intrigued by the potential of ECOG to detect brief moments of hippocampal cortical contribution. So maybe I'll just point you to this recent Nature Communications paper that was led by Sebastian Mickelmann, where we used ECOG to track information transfer between hippocampus and cortex during naturalistic story listening. And the point of the next few slides, which I'm just going to skip over without going into detail, is that we feel like this study provides a kind of proof of concept that we can detect brief moments of directed information transfer, either from cortex into hippocampus, which we think of as being related to encoding, or from hippocampus back out to cortex, which we think relates to retrieval. So I will leave that for you all to read rather than going into this. And I just want to say that from a modeling perspective, I just want to highlight, I talked about like two models today, right? In the first part of the talk, I discussed models of event segmentation and inference, but didn't touch on episodic memory. And the second part of the talk, I discussed how cortex interacts with the hippocampus, but didn't really worry about event segmentation. right? And so in our current theoretical work, we're trying to put these pieces back together, right? So we want to build a complete account of how hippocampal-cortical interactions support event understanding. And in the interest of time, I'll leave things there. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the funding agencies that supported this research. I want to thank my co-authors again. I also want to thank Sam Gershman, Lucia Maloney, Jeff Zox, and Sean Ranganeth, who are my co-PIs on the Office of Naval Research grant that supported much of this work. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. People can either write in the chat and if they prefer, and I'll ask on their behalf, or jump in and ask questions.
I'd be happy to start. Ken, thank you. A lot to think about over here. You had mentioned earlier that the decision to move from, in splitting from one sort of silo to another, it would result from a large prediction error.
Yep.
So what makes the prediction error large enough?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are a lot of variants of that. I mean, one of them is that it's less the size of the momentary prediction error and more like the kind of time average prediction error. Like if you go through a sort of epoch of like getting lots of prediction errors, then that causes. I mean, I think there are two ways of answering that. I mean, in our models, we can treat it as kind of a free parameter, right, and see what fits the data best, right? And I think the more exciting thing is to adopt the approach from the second half of the talk and feed the prediction errors as an input into that memory control module and have it try to learn a policy, right, for how much prediction error, right, is enough prediction error. And you can imagine that we could learn sort of a general policy for that, right? Like there's sort of, but also if you think about it hierarchically, right, there may be a sort of default, but then you might be able to learn in a particular situation to modulate the prediction error threshold, right? So that's something in general that we're really excited about. I mean, there's a little bit of like sleight of hand in the talk, in the sense that when I was talking about retrieval and the model, it was, figuring out on its own what it should do. But with encoding, we were sort of giving it different, scenarios by hand and seeing which one worked better, right? As opposed to having it like discover a good encoding policy on its own. So that's something that we really want to dig into. It's a really hard problem because of the temporal credit assignment thing with encoding, right? So you could encode something well or not so well, right? And then you only discover the consequences of having encoded that well or not so well much later, right? When you either succeed or fail, right? So there's a big gap in time, and having this thing that happened much later feed back and influence, your sense of the goodness of what you're doing in coding is complicated, but something we're interested in for sure.
May I have a question? Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess something basic that I'm not sure I understand. So if you watch a new movie, right? If I watch a new movie that may be very different from all the other movies that I saw, but I can kind of understand what's going on there. So I don't understand why reinforcement learning is relevant here, because that's a very slow trial and error process. So how can I understand completely novel movie from the first shot, and you are saying that this is done by training the reinforcement learning network that would require a lot
Well, I mean, I think that, right. So there are there is this sort of nuanced point. I mean, I think that the knowledge that there are two things that are being learned in tandem, right? One of them is like, what is the structure of the world, right? Like what states tend to follow what other states, right? And you can think that that sort of learning is pretty well supervised by, you know, just seeing what happens next in the world, right? There's also learning a policy for, you know, when you should open the retrieval gate, or if we make an encoding gate, right, when you should open that, right? And I agree that you wouldn't want to do the first kind of learning entirely through RL, and effectively we don't, right? So maybe that's the efficient answer to your question.
So just to understand, so you are saying that this learning process that you're modeling the network, this is not, it's not going on while I'm watching the movie, or even when I'm watching movies.
No, no, no. I mean,
this is just a general kind of knowledge about how things are in the world that occurs throughout.
Totally. I mean, the sort of commonsensical thing that, you know, we come into watching a movie having been shaped by everything that happened before that movie, right? And we're largely, I mean, the sort of complementary learning systems idea is that cortex learns really incrementally. And so during a movie, we're largely relying on the knowledge structures that were put in place prior to the movie, along with whatever episodic snapshots we happen to take during the movie, but we aren't really modifying the weights of our cortical network very much as a result of any one movie viewing.
All right.
Hi,
could I ask a question
from Jonathan Schwartz? Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. First of all, great talk. Thank you. So I'm curious if you think there's a difference, and how, between having you know, these discrete episodic memories that where they're very separately divided, split, versus something like an LSTM, which just has a long-term memory stream and different gates that control the encoding and retrieval of different nodes in its big long-term memory, or pulling out specific aspects from its long-term memory stream.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of dimensions there. And see if one of them is that the episodic memory is latent, right, in a way that something that is, you know, going on in LSTM is not latent, right? The LSTM, to the extent that it carries forwards patterns from earlier in the sequence, right? It's to the extent it can carry specific patterns is because they're being held actively. Right. So, I mean, I think from a memory systems perspective, we think that episodic memory is a much larger capacity, right, than LSTMs, right? In particular, because, you know, we borrowed that sort of dictionary like, or list-like episodic memory structure from some successful machine learning implementations of episodic memory, but in other threads of work in my lab, we've tried to build like biologically realistic models of the hippocampus, which were just sort of too computationally heavy to attach to the model at this point. But the model we're using is massively oversimplified, right? So, you know, the idea that each episodic memory gets its own little slot kind of fits with the idea that, you know, the hippocampus does pattern separation and assigns relatively non-overlapping, you know, neural substrates to different episodic memories. But we know that that breaks down in real life, and we know also that it breaks down in our more biologically realistic models. And so that's a dimension of complexity we're excited to engage with going forward. Is, you know, one major thing is reconsolidation, right? So this idea that you can go back and update an episodic memory. And so that says that instead of just routinely dumping a new row in your dictionary, you should sort of think about whether you want to dump a new row or whether you want to modify an existing row. And so that's something that we're starting to work on now. But I think that the episodic memory, because of its unbounded capacity to sort of cleanly store patterns, right? It gives networks sort of, just even in AI sort of DeepMind-ish applications, powers that they don't get through LSTMs alone.
Thank you.
Sure.
I also wanted to ask, in the blocks versus interleaved experiment, what do you predict would happen, and how would SEM deal with a situation where the schemas now merge? So if you have some prediction error that's not, oh, I'm now jumping to a new schema and I recognize that just at the beginning, but I actually noticed that somewhere along the way something has changed.
Yeah, the merging thing is really complicated, right? I mean, in the sense that SEM, the way it's built, just taking it literally, has no way of merging what has once been split, right? That is like a strong assertion that's built into it. And so I think that the interesting question there is, what evidence do we have that people can re-merge things that were once split, right? I think that there may be behavioral manifestations that you sort of have learned that like it may, anyway, I guess maybe the succinct answer there is that SEM is making a strong claim that you can't remerge things, and it will be very interesting to see whether there are any specific behavioral or neural findings that it is unable to model as a result of that strong assumption. And if so, that will obviously mean that the model needs to be revised. I mean, while I'm picking on model oversimplifications, right, this idea in SEM that you split off a whole new recurrent neural network, right? Like a physically different network when you infer that a new schema exists is wildly implausible, right? It just doesn't work to do that. And so actually something that Q is very actively working on now is to try to figure out how to implement this splitting dynamic in a more biologically plausible way, where I think it might actually be easier to address the sorts of situations that you're describing. And just a teaser for that more biologically plausible way is that I might actually have it on a slide in here, just so I have something to show when I'm, how many slides? Oh, yeah. This is the sort of way that the SEM model is set up now. You get a different RNN for every schema, right? The thing that Q is playing with now is that you sort of have one big RNN, and what happens when you infer that a new schema is present is each schema has its own like key vector associated with it. And when the model infers that like schema A is relevant, this inference network just sort of beams in the schema A key vector into this network as a sort of extra contextual input, right? And when it infers that schema B is relevant, it beams in the schema B key as an extra contextual input, right? And sort of biases processing in the network. And the benefit of this is that it greatly facilitates knowledge transfer between schemas, right? So the main practical weakness of this full splitting is that if you fork off a new baby neural network, right, it's like it doesn't know anything, right? And so there's no transfer from what you know already. And we know there's transfer, right? And it's much easier to get transfer if the knowledge is all sitting in this shared set of weights and the schema inference is just kind of beaming in different inputs. It also has the beneficial property that you can sort of blend schemas, right? So if you think you're in a situation that's 50% a trip to the beach and 50% an argument, you can sort of beam in, a half strength beach input and a half strength argument input, and then hopefully have those conjointly constrain where this RNN lands.
Right. Thank you very much. I think maybe we should wrap up for now, but thank you again very much for a wonderful talk.
Sure.
And we'll see you at individual meetings.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.